Who's the new guy?
Matthew K. One certified badass.
The year is 2004. Following the first two Doom games, id Software finally got around to releasing a third entry in the series. In order to achieve this, John Carmack created id Tech 4. While it was a revolutionary step forward for its time, especially in the lighting department, it arguably came at the cost of making most of the environments dark and cramped. The following year, however, they decided to commission Raven Software to create a new Quake in the same engine, known as Quake 4. It released on October 18th, making it now 14 years old, but how much does it really improve over Doom 3? For the most part, Quake 4 plays like an old classic first-person shooter. By that I mean you've got static health that won't just regenerate, and as many guns as you can stuff into your little pocket dimension. However, one notable difference is that you have quite a lot of teammates. In the initial part of the game especially, you've got other members of your squad seemingly around every corner. Whenever one left you, another wouldn't be far behind. The game gets more solo later on in the game, I guess to ease you into making the game more difficult, but you never really get the sense that you're alone like with the first two Quake games. Obviously, I'm not counting Quake 3, since it was literally all about the multiplayer. It's kinda hard to feel isolated in there. As with Quake 2, you've got Strogg to hunt down with your variety of weapons. Some of the weapons can feel pretty damn satisfying to use too, like the nail gun. The weapons range from a blaster, a machine gun, a shotgun, a grenade launcher, a rocket launcher, a nail gun, a hyper blaster, a lightning gun, and a dark matter gun. And of course I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that the railgun is also making a reappearance. When you can get a Strogg in your sight, it's probably one of the most satisfying weapons to use in the entire Quake series. To that end, enemies you face are mostly Strogg mooks, but you occasionally face things like hover tanks akin to the Assault Commander from Doom 3D and Iron Maidens that fire rockets like their Quake 2 counterparts. Gladiators also return and, much like in Quake 2, fire railguns at you. Another thing to note is stream protectors that are spider-like enemies that have mini rockets and plasma shots. It's like if the Revenant and Ragatron from Doom had a baby. There's also berserkers that bum rush you, again just like in Quake 2. Not sure if you're picking up on the pattern or not, but the game borrows heavily from Quake 2 and a bit of Quake 1. The final boss, although, isn't nearly as straightforward. I actually kind of fumbled with it a bit until I realized you have to shoot the core above it to expose it. It kind of reminds me of Mother Brain from Metroid in that you gotta get rid of its defense shell and then pump weapons into it until it dies. One interesting little thing is that, much like Doom 2016 after it, you can acquire upgrades for your guns, varying from new types such as heat-seeking missiles, or just a simple upgrade like extending your shotgun's clip size. Another thing to note is that the game is generally a lot brighter than Doom 3, and in duct tape mod fashion, a couple of weapons are fitted with flashlights to offset the darker areas. Because of this, I feel it's a lot more action-packed than Doom 3 was, which of course I very much appreciate. The game will sometimes, though, try to vary it up a bit with turret sections and vehicle sections. They didn't really bother me too much, but they're there and might not be ideal to a purist classic FPSer. Sadly, one overall omission was power-ups. They're technically there in the game, but it's been locked off to multiplayer only, which is a real shame. Still, the weapons and their upgrades are very satisfying to use, so this wasn't really a deal-breaker when I played through it. The Dark Matter gun in particular is like this game's take on the VFG, and it's very satisfying to use, although I rarely used it because I'm very stingy with the better weapons. Overall, I'd say the game was quite fun to play. Now, the turret and vehicle sections might be a hindrance to people who aren't fans of those kinds of things. The game will flat out halt the brakes at times for dialogue and other such modern things, but the gameplay still feels very much like a classic shooter. I'd consider it better in that regard than Doom 3 for sure. At least you aren't fumbling in the dark, and the combat just feels overall more satisfying. The game mostly follows a pretty standard story. In my humble opinion, one of John Carmack's biggest shortcomings is creative writing, and it really shows here since it's largely based off of Quake 2. Even the Strogg themselves don't seem all that creative to me since they assimilate people much like the Borg from Star Trek. In fact, your guy Matthew Kane ends up getting turned into a Strogg halfway through. Don't worry though, it seems the Strogg are complete idiots and decide to upgrade your physical abilities and senses before actually turning on the make you blindly loyal to them chip. Honestly, that would be the first thing I'd do, just to mitigate the possibility of a mutilated and pissed off Marine with Strogg abilities working against you. Fortunately, that's exactly what happens as Kane uses his Strogg abilities to interface with Strogg technology and help you go deeper into the facility. Other than that, it's your typical military story for better and worse. You've got some pretty decent dialogue moments between the characters, and them almost starting to doubt Kane's loyalties because he became part Strogg was pretty interesting while it lasted, but it's honestly not that memorable in my opinion. All you have to know is the Strogg are basically borging it up and you have to stop them. This ultimately leads with you destroying their neural network, literally in the form of a neural brain, and then all is well. Granted, the game ends by saying Kane has new orders and there's an ominous laugh in the background, so it's safe to say they intended to make a sequel, but then it just never happened. Ultimately, the plot is just fine for what it is. It's a very typical military story, albeit with a few twists and turns along the way, like Kane turning into a Strogg, but other than that, I suppose it gets the job done and succeeds in making it feel more like a classic shooter in a way. It definitely follows the Carmack philosophy of the story's expected to be there, but it's not super important. Being that it's of the Intake 4 engine, the game's aged about as well as you can expect. Which is to say, surprisingly good, since Intake 4 helped spearhead lighting systems becoming more elaborate, as well as using bump mapping that allowed the surface of models to look much more detailed than they actually are. In my opinion, one of the shortcomings of Doom 3 on a visual perspective are human faces, and I actually think they look much better here. While it's obviously nowhere near the level of a more modern game like Uncharted 4, and I wouldn't even place them above something like Half-Life 2, they definitely look very improved and human-like. At the very least, there's no obvious uncanny valley here, at least not to me. Since the game is a lot more brightly lit than Doom 3 was, it allows you to appreciate Intake 4 a lot more. Wolfenstein 2009 was the definite highlight of the engine, and you can tell that Raven Software used what they learned here as a stepping stone towards that. The highlight of the game from a visual and plot perspective is actually the Stroggification process I mentioned earlier. It's all in first person, of course, and it actually feels really painful at times to watch. Honestly, this is one of the games that I would really love to have an Oculus Rift or some other VR headset for, just because I imagine it would freak me out if I actually saw the scene through one. Other than that, the game's lighting and particle effects among the models and overall tone are quite good looking for being a 2005. I dare say it's aged much better than Doom 3. Another neat thing is that when you do Strogg, the language of the Strogg becomes clear to you. The game actually shows the Strogg characters in front of you changing into English as you're being injected with whatever they inject you with. Now, some text oddly remains illegible, but you can suddenly hear Strogg voices in plain English, and at least the larger text is now in English. The music, when it plays, is appropriately cinematic sounding, and the voice of the characters, as I mentioned before, really gets the job done. If nothing else, it never sucked me out of the experience. They certainly sound like soldiers that you'd find in any military movie, and I know that probably doesn't sound like a lot of information, but that's honestly what I got out of it.
Death of the Macron couldn't have come at a better time. It's imperative we press that advantage, which is the reason for our next operation. Lieutenant Voss, take over.
It's fine, but it's definitely not Oscar Award winning or anything like that. Really, if you're expecting much of anything to blow your socks off with how creative and over the top it is, this is definitely not the game for you. A lot of the time, there's actually no music in favor of ambience, and much like everything else in the game, it's fine for what it is. It certainly makes the moment where music is actually playing all the more impactful, since it's actually a pretty important moment to stand apart from all the running and gunning you're usually doing. The game also likes to switch it up from time to time with outdoor areas, and there's overall a much more spacious feeling than Doom 3, so that's really nice. Overall, the presentation is just fine. Graphically, it really shows off what Intake 4 was capable of, and the audio is overall quite good in its own right. You can tell it released between Doom 3 and Wolfenstein 2009, because I'd say the overall presentation is about in the middle between those two. Quake 4 is probably one of the more overlooked games by id Software. I would know because I was one of the people overlooking it and didn't get around to actually playing the game until my Let's Play series that I did near the beginning of the year. It's a real shame because when you can get around the somewhat bland plot and cookie-cutter premise, what you'll find is a very solid, classically styled first-person shooter that's a lot of fun to play. I consider it much like Quake 2 in that regard. As I've mentioned before, Carmack isn't the best with coming up with new ideas, but he knows how to make a solid engine and a good gameplay framework. Quake 4 was very amusing to play through, and I'd recommend it on that front alone, in addition to just seeing that freaky Stroggification scene. If you really like Quake, or just classic first-person shooters in general, I recommend giving it a try. Don't expect gold, but it's at least a solid bronze.